Hello, welcome to Max Spoilers for Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity. I am Kyle Hilliard. This is Cyril Vasquez.
Hi.
How's it going? How are you doing today?
I'm good. I've been playing some other stuff, but I played all the way through Age of Calamity, so I'm ready to talk about spoiler stuff.
Yeah. And of course, we are a Patreon, patreon.com/MinnMax, MinnMax, right? 2 N's.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to hear a podcast version of this discussion, you can join us at any tier on that Patreon, and then you don't have to look at our faces while we talk, which I think is worth it. I think
you can take us on the go. I think that's the bigger bonus, not the negative bonus of not having to look at our faces. I think works.
That's true.
But
yeah. So okay, as you said, you played through the game. You reviewed it for GameSpot, right?
That's right. Yep.
Okay. I had a moment there because you freelance for a number of people, so I was like, I think it's GameSpot.
No,
and what score did you give the game?
I gave it a 6, and it was a very difficult review to write, specifically because, well, for one, Nintendo is usually pretty stringent about spoiler stuff, not even about story stuff of just like, don't show this enemy, or like, don't talk about anything past like this specific point, right? And so they always have those
reveal that Terrico's name is Terrico.
Exactly, yeah. So spoiler warning for this podcast. They specifically mentioned one of the things was that like, don't mention anything other than the Hinox. The Hinox is fine because it was in a trailer, but Moblins and Hinoxes, those are the only boss enemies you can mention. So that I just had like an off, like a glancing reference to Lynels and stuff, how they're in the game. And it was a long kind of back and forth of like, okay, let's double check this to make sure that it doesn't pursue any kind of weird things. But the other thing that made it so hard was because my score was predicated a lot on things that I couldn't talk about, right? Not specifically system stuff, because I think you can usually like get away with talking about like, well, later on this happens, or like the systems do this, right? But when it comes to this game specifically, I think that its biggest failings, and the reason I scored it the way I did, was because of things that I wanted to get across to readers, obviously, but that I could not be specific about. And so I'm glad that we can do that here, right?
We're gonna have a bitch session about this.
Yeah, exactly.
I and like, it's funny. We talked about it on the MinnMax show, our podcast, and I was still kind of on a high with the game. If you go back and listen to that conversation, I was literally like 2 levels from the end, and I was like, I'm having a great time. I really like this game. I think it's exactly what I expect. The story is, fine. I'm looking forward to the ending. And it was at the ending, we'll get more into our specific opinions about it, I think, as we go along. But it was at the ending that I was like, oh, I totally get Cyril's score. I think I sent you a message that I was like, This sucks. Yes. And like, it turned me. I'm not a big, look at the game, like look at any story, media, movies, books, whatever. Like, I'm not a big, like, the end is the end, is the thing you focus on in terms of being critical of a game, or anything, a movie. Like, if everything leading up to that point has been enjoyable, then I still had a good time. But partly because of my expectations of what I thought the end was going to be and what I wanted it to be, and how almost completely opposite it was, like really, really upset me and bummed me out. Like, I think I was not happy with the ending at all.
Yeah, I'm totally with you in that. I think that a lot of people don't finish games usually, so I think it's totally fair to have like this view of the ending as being kind of like not the most crucial part of a game a lot of the times, especially because a lot of games don't really, like the final boss is really good, but whatever, it's a game
where it's going.
Yeah, it's a JRPG, so you're fighting God. Like, this is really stereotypical and typical or whatever, like boring story wise, but it's like a good showcase for the systems or whatever. But yeah, I definitely was in that same place where as I was getting to it, like the more I played of the game, the more that I liked it, until kind of this kind of nosedive, like right at the end, and it was really frustrating.
Which it does start nosediving a little bit. It starts pulling the yoke, pushing it forward a little bit at like, I don't know, the 60-70%, maybe later, but like we'll get to it.
I was trying to think of things that are kind of like this, and I think the closest thing I got to was actually Interstellar, as a movie, which I think a lot of people like. Like I actually recently went back and watched it earlier this year. And I liked it a lot more, but so much of my initial reaction of like, oh, that movie's like fine, whatever, was for this exact reason of I watched it, I thought it was really cool, and then that ending just completely face plants. And I watched it recently. I like it a lot more. I now remember more of the good parts of that movie, and I think the ending is fine. It's not great. It doesn't like match the rest of the movie, but it's fine. And I was thinking like, will I go back to this game and have that same reaction? And I don't think I will, because I think this game is so specifically built around it is sold in a lot of ways as you're going to see the thing that that Breath of the Wild did not show you, right? And I think that is a very specific thing, and for it to not deliver on that, I think is pretty disappointing.
Yeah, it kind of shows you some of it and tweaks it. But the way I want to approach this whole discussion is like, if maybe you play the game and you beat it, and maybe you like it, maybe you don't, but you just want to hear a discussion about it. I think the other opportunity is like, maybe you don't want to play this game, but you kind of want to know what happens. So I do want to actually go like through the plot beat by beat, and there's not a lot of like big plot points. You know, there's not like really these like a lot of like really big stirring moments, but like if you played the demo, it starts with time travel immediately, which was like a little, I was kind of like, that's not really what I was looking for with this, but I'll see where it goes, was kind of my reaction with Terrico flying through time, as I think the point where it's supposed to leave is when the Calamity is taking over. So like Link is like, in theory, Zelda is literally carrying Link to the recovery chamber, and I think that's when Terrico goes back in time. I think I could. Is that kind of where you were too?
It is either then. It is either it started Calamity or some amount of time after. Which really, in terms of timeline stuff, I'm not like a historian about this stuff, but it does seem like somewhat irrelevant whether like when that is, as long as it is after Ganon effectively wins the Calamity War, or whatever it's called, and Terrico wakes up sometime after Hyrule Castle is basically taken over, being overtaken, and it is attacked by a guardian, and then kind of as a safety mechanism basically jumps through time.
Yeah, and I guess some of the Calamity Ganon's malice goes through a portal with Terrico, which absolutely. But yeah, so you go from there, and it goes all the way back in time, and you're at basically the story that you want to see, right? Like, here is Link as a knight in like Hyrule. Here's Zelda kind of not yet knowing who she is, right? Yeah, and I think they kind of know something rough is on the horizon. Terrico kind of like highlights Link, like he's like points to him, be like, this guy's special. So that's how Link kind of gets pulled in with them. And he alerts at everyone that Ganon is waking up. So the process of like, he's kind of like, Terrico encourages Zelda to be like, all right, let's go find our pilots for the divine beasts. Let's go. We know who we want. Let's go track them down. And then the first place I went was to the northwest, which if you're watching this video, I don't know if that's actually accurate, but to Rivali, to the Ritos and stuff like that. And it was funny. My daughter was watching me play, and she was like, oh, this guy Rivali, he seems kind of mean. And I was like, yeah, he doesn't really like Link. Like, that's something I know from Breath of the Wild. He never gets along with Link. And then the actual mission starts, and you're slaughtering Rito. Like, you're fighting the bird creatures. And my daughter is just watching for a few minutes, and she was like, Dad, I think this is why he doesn't like you. I was just killing all these people. And I was like, you make a really good point.
Yeah, I think it's set up as like, I want to say that it is Rivali basically testing you, of saying like, you don't like you, you're in our territory, so like we're gonna give you a hard time here.
It's such an anime thing of like, we have to fight before we're friends.
It's almost like they needed an excuse to have different enemies on the screen. So like, who knows?
It was a surprise. I was like, I didn't expect to be fighting Rito. That was weird.
I want to say every other location you're basically fighting, bad guys, right? Because
you're not fighting Gorons or Zoras or anything. Yeah,
I made a beeline to Urbosa because I wanted to play as her first of the champions. I think she's probably my favorite. So I went to Urbosa first, and I think like early on, like it has some really strong vibes of just like, hey, these are these locations that I remember. Here is the the Gerudo
1-to-1 even, which I was really surprised. I was surprised at going into Gerudo town. Honestly, I was like, I can just waltz right in here.
I remember climbing this wall. Like and just seeing like those locations, in this context, and seeing Urbosa kind of like just destroy people in these locations, I think is it is this game in a lot of ways. It's just like here is the Hyrule Warriors formula, but we've basically gave it like a Breath of the Wild facelift, and that works for so much of the game.
Yeah, I mean, I think I said it in the podcast discussion, but I think it is my favorite Musou game. I haven't played a lot. I reviewed one of the Dynasty Warriors. I played the Dragon Quest Musou games. I played Hyrule Warriors, and this one I had the most fun with. I think mechanically, I think it's the most fun.
It's definitely the most interesting. Yeah. Like my history with Musou is really weird because I saw a demo, and this is very impactful, of Dynasty Warriors 2 at a GameStop, and I watched it for like 20 minutes, the entirety of the time that we were shopping there. I was just like, oh, there's a lot of guys on that screen. But the first one I really played through was 99 Nights, which was which is maybe not the best entry into that genre. But I ended up, I think I got all 1,000 points in that game, which took forever. Like, I don't think it's a great game, but I think it's
I agree with you.
Yeah. And so then I've kind of followed a little bit and kind of fell off each of the ones. Like a Dynasty Warriors Gundam, I think 2 was the one that I liked a little, just because it was Gundam and I love Gundam. But I've never really stuck with one all the way through. And this is really like the first one that I played through. And I played through Hyrule Warrior. I played through about half of Hyrule Warriors, which admittedly the campaign in that game is nowhere near as long as this one because there is like the separate adventure mode. But that game was fine. Like it wasn't great, but I think that, it kind of was what it needed to be, which was like, hey, let's just throw a bunch of Zelda stuff at you. Here's the Dynasty Warriors game. Like, and that's kind of what I expected when they announced the sequel, but for it to be like, no, we're going to take the story seriously. It's not just going to be this amalgamation of like, Zelda nostalgia. We're going to specifically target this one game and make it relevant, I think was what sold me on it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it works in Hyrule Warriors as a Zelda fan. It was cool to just like, pull down the moon from the sky when you're playing as like Majora's Mask Link and stuff like it is just a celebration of Zelda, which I think works and it's fun. And I think here they were kind of trying to go for like a celebration of Breath of the Wild, which is like not what I wanted from this game necessarily. Which, like I wanted to see the war that we only saw in snippets from Breath of the Wild, but they kind of took an approach of like, oh, you love Breath of the Wild, we're going to try to get all Breath of the Wild characters in here and stuff, to the detriment of the story, which is what I wanted from the game.
I think, and I think it's maybe, I understand how people would say like, well, that was kind of what we expected, but I think there is kind of this implicit promise that game makes of like, oh yeah, this is a Hyrule Warriors game where you go back and see the war from Breath of the Wild. And I think that does set up these expectations of like, how that story ends. You want to see that ending because they don't talk about it, right? And so for them to do what they do and kind of lean more fan service, I think is kind of. I
mean, when they showed it, they were pretty explicit. They were like, yeah, like the people that wrote Breath of the Wild are working on the story and the cutscenes, like so. Yeah, I also moving along with the plot. I kind of brushed over Pura and Robbie. Seeing Pura as an older woman, I think it was cool because she does something between this game and Breath of the Wild where she turns herself young. So by the time Breath of the Wild rolls around, she's like a child. So I think it's cool. Yes. Like that's an example of like a cool Breath of the Wild fan service thing. It's like, oh yeah, what did Pura look like before she accidentally made herself a child?
And also Impa, who I believe is in Breath of the Wild, but she's like kind of one of those like older sages, right?
Oh yeah, no, she's totally in Breath of the Wild. She tells you the story of Hyrule. You know what I mean? She's an old woman for sure. Yeah, so that's another example of like, oh, that's Impa's cool in this game. Like,
she's probably like the most effective character that I used in like her whole loop of creating copies of herself to destroy people. I think she was like the one where it's like, okay, whenever this game pushed back on me, I was like, okay, I'm just gonna use Impa and destroy this boss. Like it wasn't like she was kind of like my go-to. And her like ability is really
cool.
Hearts,
better switch over to Impa.
Yeah, exactly. And it's and I mentioned this on the main podcast, but like just the fact that the most effective character is the one that is most likely to cause performance issues on the Switch. Is pretty funny. But like she has all these cool attacks. She can mark people, and then she has the thing where like all of her clones start like a carpet bombing the arena on their little like floating like kind of flying scroll abilities. Like she's really cool. So what you're doing at the outset is, I think there's an early mission early on where you're kind of escorting Zelda because the Guardians break loose, and you're like, this is kind of the first sign of, oh, like these things are like this technology we're trying to revive, which is kind of the king's whole thing is like, oh, well, like there's this calamity happening, we have to stop it. There's this old Sheikah technology, let's use that. Like seems like a no-brainer. And then the Guardians kind of rebel, and they have to kind of tamper them down. So then you're like, okay, well, I guess we'll just use the divine beasts then. And so you're setting out to, get all the pilots on board.
Yeah, and we talked about Rivali and Urbosa. Her town's taken over by the Yiga clan, so you get to fight all the Yiga, which I think is pretty cool. Mm-hmm. And then you get to later you get to break into their base, and it's like, oh, I remember this place. I remember sneaking through here. So now it's fun to come through here just guns blazing. Yeah. Daruk and Mifa, they're pretty straightforward when you get them on board. It was kind of cool to see Sidon as a child, in real time. He's a goofball. He's fun. But outside of that, I feel like Rivali was the only one that kind of was like, oh, this is weird. The other guys were pretty straightforward.
I think Mifa has some story threads about kind of her falling in love with Link and then being a couple, but that stuff isn't really pulled on that much. I feel like they just kind of reference it in passing to say hey, yeah, Mifa and Link were kind of a thing early on, and then we're gonna make reference to it, but we're not really interested in that storyline. I think Rivali's is probably the one that they kind of linger on most in terms of here are the threads from Breath of the Wild that you remember. It's very easy to evoke Rivali just being a jerk to Link, and we're just gonna have that be his storyline, and then that'll be it basically.
Yeah, and then there is in one of the loading screens. And I think there was maybe a mention in a cutscene, but Urbosa, I guess, had a pretty close relationship with Zelda's mom, which I don't think Breath of the Wild really went into. I think maybe in the one Urbosa memory, she was said Zelda's mom or mentioned her mom or something, but I thought that was interesting, but they don't dive into it much more than that,
Yeah, because Zelda's mom is really not a character in this game at all.
I think
in this history.
A shadowy and figure in one of the later cutscenes. I remember saving it to my Switch with the intention of going back to see if they kind of showed her. I don't think they did. Yeah. After that, you get all the champions, and then you meet Aster, who it was funny because it was kind of surprising to me. I was like, oh yeah, I guess it makes sense that there would be a big bad that isn't Ganon in this game. And I'll maybe we can flash it on here screen right now. But I texted you when I ran into him, and when he's introduced, they show his name Aster, and I just took a screen cap of that and I crossed through it and I wrote Vadi, because he has the same coloration and even some of the same designs as Vadi from Minish Cap and Four Swords. Yeah. Which was I was like, that makes total sense that Vadi, some reincarnation of Vadi would be here because that's kind of his role when he does appear in other Zelda games, is he's the thing that brings Ganon to life. He's the evil guy that flips the switch or whatever you want to say. But and then they also keep his name secret for a few hours before they reveal who he is. So I really thought it was going to be Vadi, and I was actually going to be like, oh, that's kind of cool. But when they were Aster, I was like, Aster, and I immediately Googled Zelda Aster, and I was like, nope, this is just totally new guy. Yeah. He's a new character.
Yeah, my go-to reference was Aghanim from Link to the Past. I thought it was going to be a similar thing, but it's effectively someone who serves the same role, right? And it would have been weird for them to reference this stuff because Breath of the Wild has kind of low-key established itself as being the amalgam storyline, the amalgam timeline of we're kind of in all three of the split Zelda timelines at this point.
They split apart and then come back together, sort of.
Yeah, somehow. Yeah. But yeah, so that early on I figured, okay, well, from we know of Breath of the Wild 2, after you defeat Ganon, he's kind of in those tunnels as Ganondorf, presumably. Obviously, people have they haven't said anything. But I figured I guess maybe Ganon was a person, and then Astor is the person who turns the current Ganon into the huge overbearing calamity, right? And that's what I figured was going to happen. But that doesn't seem to be a
overbearing calamity in text.
Yeah, exactly. But it was weird. I guess by the end of it, I wasn't super interested in his role because he was very much I summon you, now give me eternal power, and then Ganon's like, no, how about you just die, and then just gets rid of him. Yeah. He's I figured that was good. What was gonna happen was that he would be made non-essential because no one ever talks about him. But the way it happens just makes me feel besides the one boss fight against him in the Dark Woods or the Lost Woods, he's really just not a consequential figure.
No, not at all. I liked that he was getting the Yiga to do his bidding for no particular reason. It's just a bunch of evil dudes getting together, having a good time, I guess. But I liked that he basically started killing Yiga clan members in order to help revive Ganon. I thought that was kind of cool. And I also, it also kind of turns Yiga into good guys, they're like, oh well, this evil guy is obviously evil. I don't know what you expected, but like that, like I was like, okay, I'll accept that. Like I think that's kind of cool, and I like the sort of story conceit of like, hey, we're fighting, but oh no, there's a bigger evil, so our backs are against the wall, let's all work together. So when the Yiga kind of like decide to like work with you, I was kind of like, all right, we're heading towards a sort of disastrous ending, because like if we're all teaming up and it's not going to work. That's where my mind was.
Yeah, anyway. which obviously getting into maybe a little bit of spoiler stuff, but I wonder like,
well, we can talk about it. I guess I'm just trying to save it like to be the sort of the bottom of the discussion.
Our own finale, yeah. But like by the end of it, I guess I wasn't sure if Astra was just like a product of this particular timeline version of the events, or is it implied that he was a part of like the Breath of the Wild, right? Like he was a character that was summoned and then dismissed. But was he a part of Breath of the Wild's canon, or is he just for this game? Which I don't think the game ever really touches on that at all. Like they do a lot with Astra, but I was curious as to whether he was an invention. Obviously he was made for this game, but like, is the implication that Astra had a role in that, in the story of Breath of the Wild, or was he from this specific timeline?
Yeah, I think he could work as being canonically Breath of the Wild.
Yeah.
I think it would make sense. It wouldn't break anything, I don't think.
Yeah, but that does seem to me like the one thing where they're like, yeah, let's introduce this element and then remove it so that's not relevant by the time Breath of the Wild happens.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think we should move on to the story, because I do want to.
Yeah, so then you go into the Lost Woods, the Dark Woods. That's actually where you learn Aster's name, is in that sequence, and Link gets the Master Sword, which is cool. And also another thing that like at first I was like, wait, doesn't this break Breath of the Wild? But no, he got it in the past and then he lost it and he had to get it back like over the course of Breath of the Wild. And for me at that point, I was like, well, I'm not using a different sword. I just dumped all my, because you can combine weapons. I just combined all the weapons into the Master Sword until it was this amalgam of.
I think that is kind of what you're supposed to do. I think they do allow you to use other stuff, but yeah, I don't think you'd be punished for doing that, especially like even into the end game stuff. But yeah, so the steps are pretty much like 1-to-1 at this point of like, okay, we got all the champions on board. You have those sections where you play as the divine beasts and get to kill thousands of bad guys, and then you get the Master Sword. So it's all kind of like everything begins falling into place where, okay, now we're going to have the confrontation that we're expecting to have at this point.
Yeah, which is cool and exciting, and and then like Zelda still hasn't found her ability. There's a deadline. Terrico reveals that the champions are going to die, and there's a deadline for Zelda's birthday. So I think it's when she turns 17, or maybe is it 18? That's doesn't.
I think it's 17, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And and then stuff kind of starts going bad, which was like exciting for me. Like you're trying to escape the castle as Zelda and Link and a few others. She's struggling with her, her abilities not working yet. And like, I loved the sort of getting out of the castle. I thought that was awesome. The king sacrifices himself to save Zelda, right there at the end, which I was like, okay, that's cool. Like he's a Force ghost, basically in Breath of the Wild. So this makes sense, like let's night is darkest before the dawn. This is building in a cool way,
Yeah. And I think it ties into like one of the stronger threads in that in Age of Calamity is like Zelda's kind of struggle internally of just like, I cannot figure this out. I do not know what I need to do to become the savior that I am expected to be and fulfill the prophecy, and how much her father kind of is like, anything you do that is not figuring out how to beat Calamity Ganon is a waste of time. Like Terrico eventually becomes the symbol of that, which is like, oh, I just built this robot because I wanted to. And he was like, no, like you have to be focusing on this 24/7. That is your life now. I'm sorry, but like whatever. And then for him to like sacrifice himself kind of shows how concerned he is about that, of like you are the one
committed he is.
Right. Of like, yeah, at all costs you must be protected, including my own life, the king. Right. Like, and so I think that is a good moment, I think. And like probably the moment where I started like, okay, this is getting pretty good in that, like, all these dominoes are starting to fall into place of like the thing that you want to happen is about to happen.
Yeah. And then, so that's happening. And there's a cool back and forth. It's funny talking about Interstellar and Nolan of like, not literally cutting back and forth, but there is a sort of sense of like, Okay, we got out of the castle. The champions are struggling to maintain control over their divine beasts. What the Blights, the Ganon Blights show up, which was cool. I didn't expect that, but like the bosses that you fight in Breath of the Wild are there, and they are there to kill the champions in the divine beasts. And for me, maybe for you as well, this was the moment where like I raised an eyebrow like through the roof. Like I was like, wait, hold on, what are we doing here? Because right when they're about to die, Teba, Yunobo, Sidon, and Lady Riju from Breath of the Wild proper go back in time to save the champions, to stop them from getting killed and their divine beasts getting taken over. And I was like, how did you feel about that moment? Because that was the first moment that I was like, wait a second, where are we going with this? I don't want them here.
Yeah, this was the moment where like it was like the biggest red flag to date, but I was still kind of on board at this point because I was like, okay, maybe this is some weird thing where they don't acknowledge it at all, but maybe this is still like, I wasn't like, my hopes for what was, for the ending weren't necessarily dashed, but I was like, okay, they're doing like, this is not part of the game plan, what is going on. And yes, like from there you see kind of this turn of like, okay, like, because at that point, like the Blights are here and you expect, okay, so this is the part where the champions die, right? And this is kind of you're expecting, and the game is not at all interested in that. And so they have all of the champions come in and basically help their counterpart defeat the Ganon Blight, right?
Yeah, and this is what we were talking about a little earlier when we were saying like Hyrule Warriors, the first Hyrule Warriors is like a celebration of Zelda. Let's get all these playable characters in here, all from all different games. It'll be fun. This is an example of where I think they were taking the same approach, where they're like, well, we can't make a Hyrule Warriors in Breath of the Wild and not let Lady Riju be playable. She's an important character, so we need to bring her in to be playable. And from my perspective, I was like, I don't need her to be playable. She doesn't exist as far as I'm concerned in this storyline. So it like you said, it was the first big red flag of something going differently in a bad way.
Yeah, and this is maybe like this weird kind of conflict, because they do want it to be the celebration of Zelda stuff. But I think they could have kind of created a little bit of dissonance, but have it be fine if like these characters were like post-game unlockables, along with kind of the Yiga stuff, which like I'm not a huge fan of them kind of becoming good and then realizing over the course, like for the next 100 years of that, like, oh yeah, we're evil, but by that point I didn't know what was going to happen. But I figured, like this would have been a good, like, you've beaten the game, like the like assuming that the regular timeline happens, you could be like, oh, like here is like some warrior like out of time, like I don't know, like they could have justified it as like DLC or something of just like, hey, this isn't canon, but like you can play as Lady Riju or whatever, right? Like they could have had that cake and eaten it too.
Like post game, like just everything goes out the window.
Yeah.
For me, that's fine. Like, put her in there. Let me mop up side quests with them. Like that would be fun. But
and then at this point, like it starts veering towards this fan service-y thing by having you play as the Yiga clan, having you play as the new champions, having you play as like one of the like sages from the Sheikah tribe, which is very strange. Like the giant, like because he's like you do a series of side quests and you eventually unlock.
I don't think I did these.
Like one of the older, like someone who is basically old Impa, but it's like by a different name. I don't remember the exact name. And so you can play as the sage, and eventually you unlock Terracotta to play as. But it's like this weird thing where it's like, okay, they're going really nuts, even though they seem to be very dedicated to making this important. So I get where they get the champions. Like, okay, well, no, we're not just going to throw stuff aside. But I feel like at some point they made the decision of like, well, if we're going to include these characters, they have to be part of the story. Therefore, we have to break this timeline. And I think I feel like that's where that came from, is them kind of deciding for fan service in favor of like the story, which I think at some point, I don't think, like, for as much as people like to talk about the Zelda timeline stuff, I don't think Nintendo takes it as seriously as fans do.
No, I don't think
they're willing to do that, right? Like that is kind of their thing, is that like, the story we come up with it at the end. Like the inspiration for Breath of the Wild was creating this open world Zelda, not like, let's make a Zelda where, Link is sad, like that's not their inspiration.
That's what I want. I want sad Link.
Yeah, I want sad Link also. But like, and so for them to, so this is kind of where that split happens of like, no, whatever, let's just have fun with it. And so from there, all these kind of things start, it starts receding into that more and more by saying like, hey, yeah, we're going to defeat the Blight Cannons. We're going to basically have that moment. Like they want to eat their cake and eat it too, where they're like, okay, maybe this is jumping ahead a little bit, but you get into that last fight where, you know, you're ostensibly attacking Hyrule Castle, right? And then like the divine beasts start blasting Ganon, and then they're taken over. And then the implication is that like, oh no, like they're messed up. Like we have to help them. And so I think what ends up happening is you do another round of fights with the Blights. Is that or
yeah,
is
you
that
fight them
one?
a bunch of times. There was one. Yeah. I mean, by the way, real quick, I hope someone does a supercut at some point of every instance in that game where you think someone's about to die and a character comes in and saves them last second. This game is like lousy with those moments. Like it happens so much.
Yeah.
Of someone putting up their hands and being like, "Oh no!" and then like a flash of light, like
and maybe we can talk about this a little bit later on. But yeah, like it is kind of this thing where it's like, okay, this is really bad. We need to do that. We need to take care of this. And then so like the idea is that you have to kill these 4 captains around the map, and they're just like not like significant characters. They're like a Lionel that is like ice or whatever, or like a Moblin that's lightning or whatever. And so you kill those 4 bosses, and then like maybe my favorite moment in that game happens where that's like, okay, oh, cool, we're about to storm Hyrule Castle. This is great, we're winning. And at this point I wasn't with the plot. Right, where I was like, I don't want them to win. This is not the story that I heard.
What I'm here for.
And then the Blood Moon happens, and you're like, oh no, it's the Blood Moon. And this is where I thought this was gonna go from like I was at like a 7 or 8, maybe like tentative, to like, oh, is this like a 9? Because like the idea that like, okay, we're bringing back the champions, we're gonna fix this. And then for the game to push back and say, no, you don't get to win anyway. And for like, I thought when the Blood Moon happened, I thought everyone was screwed. I thought they were all going to die. And this is like, no, you don't get to change the past. The history, the lesson that this timeline has been trying to impart stands. And like, you will be like punished for your hubris of thinking that you could change things. And I was like, when that moment happens, I'm like, is this the part where like the thing that like, you know, the very, let's say like highfalutin game design art thing is that like at the end of this game you fight a battle that you lose, right? And I was thinking,
Halo Reach ending.
Exactly. Yeah. Is this that fight? And no, it's not. Like it is. You beat those captains again, and that's all the Blood Moon amounted to. Yeah. Like this thing that is like perfectly done in terms of let's have this cutscene where like this is where like the shoe drops, and it's like everyone is terrified of this Blood Moon. Zelda is like could not be more distressed. They sell it so well in terms of like completely shifting the tone of that fight into completely dire straits. It is like that scene by itself in isolation is fantastic.
Yeah, and it also like it uses sort of the fiction of Breath of the Wild as like a gameplay mechanic, because like it really like it like hit me exactly how the designers wanted it, in the sense that I was like, oh boy, this is a tough battle, but I think I'm going to come out on top here. I'm working on the last boss. Like my health is low, but I think I'm going to make it. And then you get that sequence, like you said, where a really well executed cutscene of Zelda like freaking out over the Blood Moon. And like the second things started turning red, I hadn't even been thinking about the Blood Moon. But the moment I knew what was happening, I was like, oh my gosh, of course, the Blood Moon, everything's coming back to life, and all the bosses come back. And and I'm 100% with you. I thought that you could not win that fight and that was going to be credits. But you win. You beat the boss.
And then from there it just collapses, and then I guess, you know, maybe the I don't know if this is even a good thing, but like you get to fight Ganondorf. Like that's maybe the most interesting thing to come out of it, is that like well like before that, I guess there's some weird.
I got the name written down. It's maybe I don't have it written down, but it's not. It's it's Calamity Ganon. It's just called Calamity Ganon, but it just looks a little different than
he basically looks like Street Fighter 5 Akuma, but like you fight him. But before that, there's this weird like, you know, like setup arc for Terrico where it's like, you know, he's been helping you for a little bit, and then like the darkness takes him over, which, you know, makes sense because, you know, the darkness can, or like the Calamity whatever sludge it is, can take over Guardian, so it makes sense.
Terrico on you, basically.
So you have to fight Terrico, which is fine, I guess. Like that, if it had tied into the larger theme of like everything is falling apart, this thing that represented the hope of going back and fixing everything is lost. I think that would have been a pretty good fight of like, okay, you have to destroy Terrico. Your one hope of for the champions to get back to their timeline, in order, like, because like the darkness is going to corrupt him anyway because it's a piece of technology. I think that would have tied thematically. But no, you just kill him, and then that sets up the arc where you're supposed to post game kind of go around to the different parts of the world and collect parts to repair him so you can become an unlockable character.
And I think it was before that moment where you fight him, or maybe right after, is when you learn that Terrico was like built by Zelda using that tech that she didn't really fully understand, and then King took it away from her because she needed to focus on becoming the savior of Hyrule. And and there's like I think you see the whole sequence from Terrico's point of view, don't you? If I remember,
so.
You see young Zelda.
There are definitely cuts in that
that
cutscene. I don't know if it's 100% from his view, but you definitely see parts of that scene through his lens, right? So yeah,
and I think it's also around this time that, by the way, remember how we were so compelled that the king died? Like, we just thought that was really well done.
Yeah.
And I mean, I felt it. I shed a tear for the king. He's fine.
Yeah, it's like, and then he's playable. Like I think I don't know if you can use him in the final mission, but he's definitely playable after at some point. And so he had a piece of technology in his pocket that saved him or something.
Yeah,
and so then you kill Calamity Ganon. Everything is fine. The champions get to go back to their timeline. You have to rebuild.
Master got absorbed at some point.
Yeah, he's gone. Whatever. They basically deleted him. They just said like he's no longer a story point.
Real quick. So before we go into that, there is a moment where with Calamity Ganon, he is invincible. Like when you first fight him, again, maybe like I was like, is this an unwinnable fight that we have here on our hands?
Yeah.
Is that what's happening? And then Terrico sacrifices himself and blows up. To make Ganon invincible, I guess. Right, so you could start hitting him.
And it wasn't as acute as like the Blood Moon moment, but there was definitely like I was holding out some hope that at some point this would go wrong. It does not. You get to win. The champions go back to their timeline, and they're like, okay, great. Now we get to live out the rest of our days scot-free. No one has to learn a lesson about anything. Bye, folks, and then credits. It's.
I gotta find. You go ahead. I'm gonna find the message I sent you.
Yeah, but like I could not at that point. I could not have been angrier at this game of just like how do you blow something this easy, and like. It kind of underscores how little they care about the plot in that game, in that is all set dressing for their design, which is fine. I get it, but I think this game had been pitched as something different, as like people really took to Breath of the Wild, not just from like it's one of the greatest open world games ever made, great, but also people really latched on to this version of events, that like the fact that this was effectively just shy of like maybe Link to the Past, the only Zelda that feels kind of like as dire, because even like Ocarina, and I know everyone likes to say that Majora's Mask is really sad, but there is something like impending doom in Majora's Mask, but there is not. We already lost, right? And here it like in Link to the Past, there is like this kind of sense that you lost a war previously, and this is kind of like the simmering kind of ashes of an empire that is trying to come back. And in here is kind of the similar thing of we lost, we like this technology that we did not understand, which is like a very clear metaphor for like, if we don't understand how to use technology, it's going to destroy us, which is pretty relevant. Like the idea that, okay, we're going to use the Sheikah thing. Like this is going to be this is our easy fix. Technology is our easy fix. But if we don't understand that, it is going to backfire on us spectacularly. And so like that was my favorite part of that storyline, was seeing kind of how that they got to here, and seeing like the fact that Breath of the Wild was kind of like the aftermath in a lot of ways of like, this is what it's like for technology to have basically destroyed the world in some sense.
Yeah. I mean, I argue that Breath of the Wild is a post-apocalyptic story. Yeah. Like, and that's one of the things I like about it, is you're seeing like, which Ocarina of Time touched on a little bit, but like you're seeing a world where Link lost. Like you're seeing a world where Ganon won, and you're trying to pick up the pieces. And I love that. like, and for them to kind of, I mean, they didn't undo it. They just like set up a different timeline.
Yeah, they just decided not to look like not bother with that kind of events, right? Like that series of events. And like this feel like for Breath of the Wild, it felt even more dire, because in Ocarina of Time, the implication is like this is like a terrible what if, right? Where you go into the future, like this is what happens if Ganon wins, but you can prevent it, right? Because at the end you go back in time and everything's fine. Link has his childhood back or whatever, and everything is great, even though whatever, you know, the timeline fractures and that has relevance. But the implication is that like the 7-year skip is kind of a what if, whereas here it feels final of like this is what happened, not this is what could happen.
This isn't something for you to go and undo, you know?
Right, exactly. And that's the problem, is that like this game, it does exactly that, is it says like this is a game that we are ostensibly all like, I know people like Zelda fans or whatever, but we're all ostensibly, we see this as a franchise for families, right? And so they're like a movie that is for families cannot, or a game cannot have a sad ending. It cannot end this way. So therefore we are kind of just scaffolding like the what we can and turn it into a positive ending where everyone gets to be happy, right? And I feel like that is in some sense, like I get it in some sense, but it feels like terrible for anyone who had made any investment otherwise. And I get that, you know, like some level, like you said, it is a celebration of Breath of the Wild and not like meant the story, but that feels like an error on their part to pitch this as like, yeah, you get to see the war and then to not show you the actual war, I think is kind of a failure.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could make an argument that they showed you the war, but like, I don't know. 9 a.m. on Thanksgiving morning is when I beat this game, and I messaged you, and I just was like, that ending was the exact opposite of what I wanted from this game. That is so disappointing. They squandered a total layup that they served to themselves. And also, what does that mean for the Breath of the Wild timeline? Like, I don't understand. Are we just in alternate timeline territory now? Like, it just doesn't matter, I guess.
Yeah, like I can't imagine Breath of the Wild, you know, the sequel to Breath of the Wild, does anything at all with this. That I don't think they're going to acknowledge that. I can't imagine, because like it just feels like Breath of the Wild, not that we saw a ton of it, but like it does feel like it is taking place in the wake of the Breath of the Wild timeline, which it should. And like if this follows the Calamity timeline, I'm going to be real mad. But it definitely feels like them setting that up. So I can't imagine this is going to refer to that. But at some point you have to acknowledge that Zelda made Terrico. So what does that do in Breath of the Wild, right? Or is Terrico canon? Is Astra canon? Is any of that stuff like on the table for them?
God.
But yeah, it is.
Also, when did Sidon and Yunobo and Teba and Lady Riju, when did they go back in time? Like, is this after the events of Breath of the Wild? Is it like sometime before the events of Breath of the Wild?
I imagine it's after.
It at this point? I don't know.
I think it's because Daruk has like the protect. No, well, I think, or not Daruk. His successor, Yunobo, right?
Yeah.
Like, does he have Daruk's protection at the start when you meet him?
I think, gosh,
or does he get it?
I think maybe he does, because I feel like Daruk says something like, "Oh, you have." That's how he knows he's like unique or special, I guess. But like, yeah, like let's say in Breath of the Wild, the sequel to Breath of the Wild, you go find Sidon, right? Like you go to Zora's domain and you find him there. Is there going to be like a little line of dialogue where he's like, yeah, I went back in time and fixed an alternate timeline. It doesn't affect ours. Ours is still kind of messed up.
Don't worry about it.
You know, a different timeline. I don't know why I felt compelled to do that.
Which, it actually does remind me of another theme that this game just totally just forgets of, like, of Breath of the Wild being like, the world is messed up, technology will destroy us, and it's going to be up to the next generation to fix this stuff. And so they're kind of like, those champions are effectively cleaning up the mess of the generation previous. And this just says like, no, like the older guys are actually really cool.
Is like really, it's a lot of like young adult fiction, really, like like Avatar and Harry Potter.
Yeah, and that's one of the other kind of themes that that Age Calamity just totally unfurls and says like, no, actually the older generation was cool when they were using like terrible technology to destroy a bunch of people without thinking about it.
The boomers did it, man.
That's actually cool. They were the greatest generation, of course. They just had a few snags along the way that really we're gonna fix. So yeah, like and at that point, you know, the game ends, roll credits, and then like you go on this kind of fetch quest-y thing where you're kind of going to
Actually, when about halfway through the credits, I think actually for me, this was my experience. You rip the cartridge out of your console and you put it on a shelf, and you just never want to see it again.
That's
I don't know if maybe that didn't happen for you.
That's the good ending. Because then after that,
the good ending is right when the blood moon happens. You just fail and you don't let it restart.
Exactly. That's how I fixed that game. But yeah, you travel to different parts, which is like one of the game's cooler touches, is that like that kind of journey is implied by like, okay, here's a point on the map where you have to do this, and then there's this other point at the other end of the map where you're kind of traveling across, and so they can kind of get that point across without actually, animating that or like making cutscenes out of that. I think that's a cool thing where it's like, oh yeah, Link and Zelda traveled far and wide to fix Terrico. And then like I figured this was going to be a way bigger thing. Like I was hesitant about even writing the review until I saw this, because a lot of the times you'll see like a post. Well,
I looked it up on YouTube. I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
But like the idea, because so many of my points were like, I think this ending sucks, and I wanted to have the authority of like being able to say, no, I've seen that post game stuff. It is also bad. And it is not even bad. It's just like, okay, you fix him. Terrico's an unlockable character now. Go
cool.
do.
I didn't know they were playable, but yeah, the cutscene is just basically him waking up, and everyone's like, "Oh, you fixed him! Congratulations!" Right?
Yeah, which is like obviously not a thing worth doing if you're not a fan of the game, but like, yeah. And at that point, I was just like, okay, great. I can just kind of I can write with conviction at this point, and yeah, it was really frustrating because like when I published the review, a lot of people were like, well, like you said that it's a good Muso game, but like I can't, like it is so weird for people to just not be in the headspace to understand where you're coming from. Just like, this, like the why, like you reviewed it way lower than everybody else, like screw you, like what are death threats or whatever. And like just seeing people like my response was like, I can't talk to you. We cannot talk about the same things because I don't want to just spoil the game for you. And I can totally see why people liked it more than I, because if you're able to put aside that kind of stuff, it's like I said, it's probably my favorite Muso game that I have played. And on that department, it still kind of gets grindy, but it is probably the best combat that series has had. Is not like a huge fan or anything, but like I think it works really well as a Muso game. But like to me, that stuff doesn't like pales in comparison to how disappointing I found this ending.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you, man. It's funny because you can go back and hear my counter as someone who hadn't seen the ending yet. How I was like, excuse me. I think I even said like, it seems like I like this more than Serial, right? Is kind of like where I was at. Like, but now I'm like on the same page as you. Like, I genuinely don't know the last time I was so disappointed in like a story.
Yeah,
in terms of media. Like maybe I didn't like the last Star Wars movie, but like that was maybe those two are like in recent memory of like, when was the last time I was like just like ugh, like at watching credits I was like, I don't like this.
I can almost I remember mine pretty well, which is Final Fantasy VII remake, but I think
that's well, you know what, actually I didn't like that.
The difference, the difference
I had lower expectations for that one though.
That's fair, but I think to me that my frustration with Final Fantasy VII's ending, which I thought was like a lock for like worst ending of the year, but
I totally agree with you. At least they can undo in the next part. We know the next part for this, right?
Right. But for me, like personally, it was not necessarily like I think this ending is like bad. I think it is bad, but it's kind of this mixed emotions of I like where this is going. I just think they delivered it terribly. Because that game specifically had felt like such a welcoming game for someone like me who hadn't played it and said like, oh yeah, you can be a Final Fantasy VII fan too. And that ending is just completely, if you have not played Final Fantasy VII, none of this is going to make a lick of sense, and we're not even going to try. But we can talk about that.
Ask
like
your friends. You have a friend who's played it.
Go watch the ending a couple times. Listen to people break down a podcast, that ending on a podcast, and
maybe
also
like a deepest dive. Maybe like an 8-hour discussion about
exactly. Yeah, which you can go watch on our YouTube channel. Or like just straight up read a wiki synopsis of like, okay, this is what this scene was referring to or whatever. So like but this to me is also like. So the intent was there that I appreciated. It's just the delivery. Whereas I think the delivery on this is like whatever. I don't think it's like a particularly good moment from the point where it shifts. I think it's fine. But the intent here feels so just like downright cynical in a way and cowardly to say like, no, we want this game to sell. Not that anyone's going to make it to the end of this game because this game's like 30 hours long. and we're just going to make sure that everything is wrapped up neatly in a way that they did not have to, because this is a prequel. Like, the expectation is there that, like, hey, if you want to see how, if you want to see the good version of this ending, go play Breath of the Wild, right?
Yeah, and I'm trying to think now, like, just sort of talking about the idea of having played the originals and stuff. I was like, I would obviously feel different if I had not played Breath of the Wild. Like, this would just be like, but like, I don't think this game is for people who haven't played Breath of the Wild, frankly. Like, I really don't. So it was the wrong call, I think. Ultimately.
I almost feel like if you have no association with Zelda, I can almost say like, this is a pretty good Musou game. If you're like a huge fan of Musou games, remove from whatever context, if you played the original Hyrule Warriors and like Fire Emblem Warriors and Dragon Quest Warriors, because it said Warriors in the title, I guess this is a good one of those. But I can't I wonder what the Venn diagram is that of like people who just did not care about the story and can just skip all the cutscenes and just get to the Musou stuff, and people who would buy that game, right, instead of playing something else, like the mainline Dynasty Warriors games.
It's confusing. I wish they had just. I don't know why they felt so beholden to have a happy ending. Like, I just don't. Yeah. It serves no purpose, and like no real. And purpose. I mean, there's also the factor of, like, you're right, Serial. Like, a lot of people probably won't make it to the end, like, which, that's a bummer for the designers and stuff, but like, I think it's true. Maybe I'm completely wrong. Maybe that's an unfair assumption, but
and to be fair, I think like over as the game has released and people have played through that, I've been getting messages of like, I totally agree with your review. I think that ending sucks. Like, which is, like, obviously I don't want people to hate the game or whatever, but like, it is kind of validating of like, okay, great. Now people finally understand where I was coming from in that review. Because there's definitely a lot of like, there was definitely a real, like, don't read the comments moment of like, oh, this is just going to be the whole day. If I keep looking at these, I shouldn't really, because like they just straight up don't know. Right. So yeah, but I'm almost happy.
You shouldn't leave mean, hateful comments no matter what, but
for sure.
Don't do that
like,
anyway.
Like, at this point, I can't even argue with them. So it's like, whatever, just ignore them.
Yeah.
But I'm almost glad in a sense that they do go out of their way, like that this isn't, like that it doesn't feel like they have to take anything from this, because at this point it's like, okay, great, I can safely ignore this game and still be really excited for whatever they end up doing in the next Breath of the Wild game, right? So
this stands on its own for better or worse. I wish it didn't. I wish it was canon, but like, at this point, it's not canon, right? I mean, we can definitively say, I think, right?
I can't imagine that. Like, I mean, like, canon is a weird thing, but like, I can't imagine that you will need to play this game in order to understand Breath of the Wild 2, or even like, I would be curious to see what a new playthrough of Breath of the Wild is like, informed by this game. I can't imagine it'll be that different, right? Because I think a lot of that game's power was because of the things that it didn't say, right? Of just like, oh, this is just a vague memory of the past. Don't worry about it too much. Like, focus on the now, and how you can fix it. And and this game just answers questions that like you were curious about, but ultimately proved like not as interesting as the question.
Oh, you know what? Maybe this will be my final thing. But like, one thing that I was really hoping for, like, I was thinking of. Kojima does this a lot. I feel like Metal Gear Solid 5 in particular answered a question about the Metal Gear Solid canon that no one really had, right?
Yeah.
Like, I'm not going to spoil Metal Gear Solid 5, but there is like the twist, I guess you could say, at the end is one of those things where you're like, oh, that explains that. And you're kind of like, oh, well, yeah, I guess I just kind of took that element of the story for granted and didn't really think about it.
Yeah, for you to spend like 50 hours like I did to answer like a question that I think in the greater timeline of that series would just be like, hey, fun fact. Like,
yeah, and like, I think it worked really well in Metal Gear Solid 5 in the sense that like it answered a question I didn't know I had, and so that made it a legitimate revelation, because it wasn't even like, I can't wait to see who Snake's parents are. It was like, oh, that makes sense. What I was kind of hoping for Hyrule Warriors was maybe with Terrico being there might be an explanation of what Zelda was up to for the 100 years while Link was getting.
Yeah, I can see
because
that.
we all kind of take it for granted. I think there's an in-universe explanation that she's just holding back Ganondorf, but I don't know how she survived that long. I don't know how she didn't age.
Yeah,
and I was hoping that maybe Terrico would provide this revelation of like, when Link was ready, I was able to bring Zelda to the appropriate time in the timeline, you know, which would explain why Link can take forever and like buy real estate and just go fishing and stuff. Like, because it's not that Zelda's there waiting for him literally, it's that Terrico is, you know, taking her to a specific moment in the timeline when it's time.
Yeah.
That didn't happen, obviously. But that was like my sort of like, ooh, that would be a really cool way to end it, you know, which still giving it sort of a positive spin. You could still have a good ending, but still have the sort of like the downer ending too. But, you know, there's why hypothesize for something that didn't happen.
Which is, But yeah, I think that kind of, we got it all out of our systems. I think is a good way to say.
Yeah, I don't have to complain to my wife now anymore about how much I didn't like the end of this game.
Yeah, now you have a public venue for that.
That's right. But hey, thanks so much for watching. Let us say nice things to Suriel in the comments about how good his review is and how right he is. And you know, if you're here, if you've discovered us because you wanted to hear two people talk about Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity, check out the MinnMax show, our podcast. We got a bunch of other series. Check out our Patreon, and thanks. I can't wait for Breath of the Wild 2. I think I'll be more satisfied
for that.
Do you want to get your name or Twitch or YouTube channel in the description of everything we release? Record a podcast with us, put a picture of your choice on MinnMax's TV, or a whole lot more? You can check out the benefits for supporting us on Patreon. If you support MinnMax at any tier on Patreon, you can submit questions or comments for us to read on the air, and you'll also get access to the wonderful MinnMax Discord. We need your help to keep this whole indie trainer rolling, so we'd appreciate it if you checked us out.